Those who follow a path of awakening have a strange quality, a silent loneliness that accompanies them like a shadow. Ordinary connection is challenging because of a profound understanding, rather than an externally imposed loneliness. Mutual delusions and shared ideals of what life should be bind most people together. However, the bonds that formerly bound them to others start to weaken the instant one breaks through the dream. One who perceives the essence of reality is incapable of deceiving. They don't look for approval or a sense of belonging just to feel comfortable. They are not mesmerized by gossip, status games, or the never-ending quest for things that will eventually become obsolete. And the world finds them odd because of this. They might receive politeness, smiles, and even admiration from others. They won't really connect, though, because most people believe that relationship is based on shared delusions. Furthermore, there is no going back to the previous state of being after one has crossed over. The fact that most friendships are based on necessity is a disturbing reality. The person who has seen something beyond does not require amusement, comfort, or a diversion from their own emptiness. In that way, they don't clean or grip, and they don't have relationships that are only there to pass the time or keep the peace. They find beauty in the calm place where truth arises, in solitude, and in the immensity of themselves. Such a person seems aloof, even haughty, to others who still operate inside the confines of the intellect. However, it is simply the lack of the desire to perform or to be anything other than who they are. It is not arrogance. They are also hard to relate to because of this. The world does not genuinely want to know the wise, but it does appreciate them from a distance. Since most individuals would prefer to maintain their comfy illusions than to face the uncertainty, getting to know them would be risky. People who follow this road don't complain about being alone because they realize that it's freedom, the ability to live without compromising, rather than loneliness. To view the world as it is, not as one would like it to be. And although the outside world could perceive this as having no friends, the reality is much more profound. The person who has relinquished illusions has reconciled with everything. The realization that the world is what it is incredibly unnerving. Everything that used to feel certain, substantial, and familiar starts to fade in that instant, as though a curtain has been lifted. What is good, what is wrong, what one should do, and how one should live are no longer the laws that formerly seemed so definitive. Along with this change comes a calm detachment from the outside world and its inhabitants. It is not a decision based on resentment or animosity. One doesn't want to be by themselves. Instead, it comes naturally from comprehension and the ability to see beyond the layers of indoctrination that hold most individuals to the social illusions. It gets harder to play the games that used to seem vital as one becomes more aware of the truth. Small chat seems pointless. Noise is what gossip feels like. The never-ending need for approval, prosperity, and recognition seems futile and a short-term diversion from something more profound. Truth is not sought after by most people. They look for solace. They are looking for familiarity. They look for proof that their lifestyle is correct, that their convictions are sound, and that their decisions are warranted. One is no longer a part of the group dream, however, the instant they go beyond this. They start to feel alienated. The world no longer acknowledges them as one of its own, not because they have rejected it. All of this is a strange paradox. Those who stay sleeping are not judged by the one who sees beyond illusion. There is just understanding, not rage, frustration, or superiority. They understand the reasons behind people's adherence to habits, beliefs, and pursuit of diversions. They know the majority are just scared, fearful of the unknown, fearful of letting go, afraid of probing too thoroughly, for fear that all they have built their identity upon would crumble. The awakened one therefore moves in a different way. Since they understand that truth must be sought rather than bestowed, they do not impose their knowledge on others. They don't try to persuade or argue, since they realize that most people just want to be reassured and don't want to be emancipated. This establishes a gap, an unavoidable one, but not a deliberate one. Friendships fade. Discussions grow tense. The once natural relationships now seem forced. One finds themselves standing at the borders of the world, observing others as they navigate life. The more they embrace their own awakening, there is a temptation to revert to the old habits, to attempt to blend in once more, to pretend for the sake of friendship, as though in a dream. However, the truth cannot be hidden once it has been revealed. There's no turning back. The awakened individual is not indifferent to other people. Instead, they might have a more profound affection, more empathy than has ever existed. However, this love is not based on need, expectation, or attachment. Rather, it is a river that flows without expecting anything in return. Nevertheless, this love is frequently misinterpreted because it is unconditional. People assume that friendship entails involvement in the shared dream, affirmation, and assurance. And they believe something is amiss when they fail to discover this. That the person who has been woken seems aloof, chilly, or even conceited. However, the reality is far more straightforward. The awakened person does not turn away others. They just don't act that way. They don't engage in pointless conversations, push connections that don't feel natural, or entertain drama, conflict, or emotional gain. They don't look for companionship in order to escape loneliness, because to them, loneliness is not a threat. It is peace, not loneliness. The great split is at this point. The majority of individuals avoid sitting in silence with their own thoughts by cramming their days with noise, diversions, and constant activity. The awakened person, however, is not afraid. They have confronted the emptiness within and realized that it is a huge, boundless realm of awareness, rather than nothingness at all. They have a complete understanding of who they are and are not attempting to hide from it. Therefore, they don't need to be chased and don't chase after people. They just are. Many people are unfamiliar with this existence. Being with someone who doesn't ask for anything from you, doesn't need your approval, and doesn't follow social engagement norms might be disconcerting. People then start to wander away one by one. It's because they don't comprehend the awakened, not because they don't like them. They are unable to relate to someone who does not join in the tacit agreement to pretend, who does not indulge in superficiality, or who does not require validation. Nevertheless, this seclusion has a deep charm. Isolation is not the case. There is a return to reality. It is a step into the immensity of life itself, away from the cacophony. It is a life free from masks, pretense, and the never-ending pressure to be someone else's thing. The ancient traditions may seem alluring for the sake of connection at times of longing, when one wishes they could go back in time. However, the enlightened person knows deep down that such relationships would be phony, based on mutual illusion rather than reality. They follow their own way alone because they have outgrown the urge to fit in with a world that does not yet understand itself, not because they have been exiled. The majority of people think that mutual respect, shared ideals, and a strong connection are the foundations of friendships. This appears to be the case at first glance, but upon closer inspection, it becomes clear that most relationships are based on far more flimsy, shared illusions. People gather together not necessarily because they fully comprehend one another, but rather because they support one another's worldviews, confirm one another's beliefs, and offer diversion from the more difficult issues they might not want to confront. Although humans are gregarious animals, A deeper fear of loneliness frequently underlies this urge for connection. In a world that frequently seems uncertain and chaotic, people look for friendships to fill voids, to prevent quiet, and to foster a sense of belonging. Common ideas, hobbies, and routines serve as the foundation for their relationships, but they hardly ever pause to consider whether these things actually have any real meaning. Mutual engagement in the same world, whether it be one centered on business, entertainment, or cultural norms, is frequently the foundation of friendships. People no longer fit within the structure that used to hold their relationships together when they start to awaken to that reality. A person will naturally start to recognize that the ties they formerly had start to wane if they begin to see past the surface of life, ask serious questions, and stop holding on to the same attachments. They are not incapable of love or friendship because they have undergone some sort of fundamental shift, but because the delusions that formerly connected them to one another no longer exist. The once interesting conversations now seem to be the same ones over and over. The dramas that appeared important now seem inconsequential. The never-ending conversations about success, status, and outside approval become less compelling. The majority of friendships are based on a shared commitment to upholding particular beliefs rather than on reality. People connect on their common grievances, gossip, and hardships. Their aspirations, wants, and anxieties are what bind them together. However, what occurs if one player stops participating in that game? What happens if someone no longer defines themselves by external standards of achievement, no longer views life as a contest, and no longer thinks that battle is necessary? The basis of those friendships starts to deteriorate. In human interactions, there is an unwritten law that says you have to play your part and comply in order to belong. You have to participate in the collective reality that has been established. You become an outsider if you decline to take part, and if you no longer see significance in other people's actions. They no longer understand how to relate to you, not because you have rejected them. When someone starts to wake up, they frequently discover that they are unable to carry on the same talks without feeling alienated. They observe that a lot of conversations are just means to sidestep more profound realities. People chattering to avoid looking at their own lives. People talking merely to fill the gap. And people whining about the world without ever considering their own part in it. They also discover that they are alone after they cease engaging in these patterns. It's not necessarily painful to be alone. Losing a buddy can first feel unpleasant, since it can be perceived as a kind of rejection. It soon becomes evident, however, that this is not rejection at all. It is merely the outcome of overcoming the delusions that initially produced those linkages. Few people want to listen, but most people want to be heard. Few individuals like to be challenged, but most people desire encouragement. They prefer to be in the company of people who make them feel at ease, rather than people who make them doubt who they are. Therefore, a person stops offering the solace that others seek when they start to see through the layers of deception that comprise the social environment. They transform into something completely different, not a friend or an enemy, but something eerie that defies classification. For this reason, people who awaken frequently discover that their social circle is getting smaller. Their lack of affection or concern is not the reason. It's because they don't act fake. They don't participate in partnerships that are only there to support delusions. The illusory sense of security that many people seek is not something they offer. They are in a zone of truth instead, and truth is something that many people find hard to confront. This is not to imply that all human connections are illusory, or that all interactions are pointless. Rare friendships and connections exist that go beyond the typical patterns of social interaction. These are the connections that are based on more than just similar values or passions. They are based on a deep understanding that transcends language and on mutual recognition. However, these connections are uncommon and cannot be coerced. They only appear when both people have attained a state of awareness in which they are merely present with one another, without of illusion or expectation, and no longer require anything from one another. But for the majority, friendships are a means of preserving the status quo. They are based on common diversions, convenience, and the tacit understanding to ignore reality. The friendship will unavoidably start to fall apart when one of the members starts to look past this. It's because nothing is keeping it together anymore, not because there is conflict. The chosen ones frequently walk alone because of this. They don't hold on to relationships just for their own sake. They don't impose meaningless talks. They don't engage in the never-ending cycle of assurance and validation that most friendships demand. Rather, they embrace isolation as a natural condition of being, rather than as a hardship. They are aware that genuine connections are uncommon, and that most relationships are fleeting, lasting only as long as both parties continue to live in the same delusion. Relationships are not something they maintain for their own sake. They don't force pointless conversations. The constant loop of affirmation and validation that most friendships require is not something they partake in. Instead, then viewing seclusion as a hardship, they accept it as a natural state of being. As long as both parties are still living in the same delusion, they know that true connections are rare and that most relationships are short-lived. They have come to the realization that there is nothing to fit into, yet they do not aim to fit in. This insight brings a profound sense of liberation and tranquility. The awakened person knows better than others, who might interpret their solitude as loneliness. They feel more adrift than ever, even though they realize that most individuals are never really alone. Even though they are surrounded by people, conversations, and incessant social engagements, they nonetheless feel empty on the inside. However, the person who has shed their illusions does not have to occupy this area with other people. They have discovered the only friendship that really matters as a result of getting to know themselves. The foundation of human relationships is a careful balancing act between mutual understanding, shared experiences, and an underlying need for approval. The majority of people look for companionship, for the comfort of reinforcement, as well as the pleasure of connection. They prefer to be in the company of others who share their values, give them a sense of belonging in a big, unknown world, and validate their feelings. Because of this, people in social circles frequently share similar beliefs, behaviors, and ways of thinking. This equilibrium is upset when someone starts to follow a different route, starts to doubt the rules, or stops participating in the social customs that used to make them feel included. They change in terms of their own essence, rather than their outward look or manner of life. People are frequently turned off by their very existence, which turns into a silent challenge to those around them. People are drawn to things that are familiar and give them confidence that they are headed in the right direction. A person becomes an anomaly, something that is difficult to classify or comprehend, when they leave that comfortable framework. They are unnerving because of this. They no longer fit into the framework that others have unwittingly agreed to maintain, not because they want to. There is frequently an unwritten agreement in social dynamics. We will engage in the same emotional patterns, support one another's opinions, and reinforce one another's stories. However, the flow is disrupted when one individual ceases taking part in this exchange. They no longer play along with the expectations. The way they react has changed. They no longer look to the same people for approval. For people who are still engaged in the cycle of trying to fit in and get approval, this is extremely unsettling. A person quits playing the game, in which most individuals have a strong emotional attachment, when they begin to distance themselves from the desire for approval. In a dispute, they are no longer required to be correct. The need to prove themselves no longer drives them. They no longer look for approval or acknowledgement. Their focus changes from seeking approval from others to finding inner tranquility. Additionally, This change renders them incompatible with the social dynamics that the majority of individuals depend on to feel like themselves. Many partnerships are held together by validation. People look for companions who give them confidence, who reinforce who they are, and who offer consolation when they are unsure of themselves. Someone is seen as cold, indifferent, or aloof when they stop having this conversation. In actuality, however, they are just no longer providing the reassuring routines that are necessary for the majority of partnerships. Consider a situation in which a group of people are continuously looking to each other for approval, conversing about common problems, grievances, and desires. Imagine for a moment if one member of that group no longer looks for the same approval. They pay attention, yet their responses are not what is anticipated. They don't act out needless drama. They don't repeat the same frustrations or provide meaningless words of support. Although they are there, they don't take part in the emotional interactions that other people rely on. This behavior can be unnerving to individuals who are still caught in the loop. They can think the person is aloof, disengaged, or even conceited. Even in situations where there is no criticism, individuals could feel as though someone is judging them. They could feel vulnerable, as though their own need for approval has just been revealed. And so, instead of embracing this presence as an opportunity for growth, they distance themselves. They look for people who will keep giving them the same kind of comfort they are used to. Not because it is bad, but because it makes people face their own reliance on other people's praise. The lack of validation causes discomfort. It demonstrates the extent to which their perception of themselves has been influenced by the opinions of others. There is a hole left when someone stops taking part in this cycle, one that many people would like to avoid, rather than investigate. For this reason, people who follow an awareness-based path frequently feel isolated. It's not that they don't give a damn. They don't lack love, that's for sure. The reason for this is that they no longer support the patterns that underpin the majority of interactions. They no longer provide the same comforts. The identities that other people have constructed for themselves are no longer reflected in them. They are in a state of deep presence, peaceful comprehension, and neutrality. And this makes a lot of people uncomfortable. The majority of individuals don't look for the truth in relationships. They look for solace. They look for familiarity, approval, and confirmation of their pre-existing opinions. Someone is seen as an outsider and someone who does not belong when they cease to provide these things. It's not because they've done anything bad, but rather because they don't fit the expectations anymore. The paradox of awakening is this: one needs less the more they see. The more one comprehends, the less they look for approval. Additionally, they keep fewer contacts, the less they look for approval. For the simple reason that most relationships necessitate a reciprocal participation in illusion, not out of resentment or rejection. But loneliness is not a punishment for people who have transcended this. It is not the same as loneliness, as most people think. It is just a logical result of being freed from the desire for approval. It's a peaceful release, a place of inner tranquility where genuine awareness, rather than dependency, is the foundation of relationships. A person no longer fears being alone once they achieve this state. They don't look for company just to satisfy a need. They don't participate in friendships that demand that they be someone they're not. They navigate the world without feeling the need to be noticed, understood, or accepted. They discover a form of freedom in this that most people will never know. The structures that people have constructed around their lives greatly influence how they connect with one another. A certain amount of predictability is maintained by the network of unwritten norms, customs, and expectations that underpin society. When interactions follow recognizable patterns, behaviors conform to common norms, and people know what to expect from others, they feel at ease. This fosters a sense of safety, a perception that everything is well organized and understandable. An individual becomes an oddity when they start acting differently from these norms. The predictability that most people depend on to maintain social harmony is upset by them. They no longer participate in the usual discussions. They no longer respond in the expected ways. And they no longer follow the unspoken rules that keep social circles cohesive. Even though it is slight, this shift is quite unnerving to people who are still rooted in the systems that shape their world. Mutual reinforcement is the foundation of most partnerships. People connect because they have similar life views, difficulties, and convictions. The basis on which these relationships are based is unintentionally upset when someone questions these structures, not by confronting them directly, but simply by ceasing to participate in them. People who used to feel understood now experience a sense of alienation, as though the language they have used their entire lives is suddenly being met with silence. This is not because the person has become cold or cruel, but rather because they have broken free from the habits that most people unknowingly follow. They no longer look to shared difficulties for approval. They don't support the stories that other people use to define themselves. Additionally, they avoid emotional interactions that stem from a desire for validation or assurance. Just by being there, they serve as a silent reminder that there is another way to live that is independent of approval from others. This can be alienating to people who are still a part of social structures. They may have a sense of abandonment, as if the person who has changed is no longer reachable in the same manner. They could feel as if they have lost the comforting sense of familiarity and a shared connection. Additionally, they frequently separate themselves from the person who no longer plays along, rather than challenging their own allegiance to these institutions. This distance isn't always deliberate. It occurs quietly, with minor adjustments to interactions and a slow loss of connection. Talks get shorter. There are fewer invitations, and an unexpressed uneasiness takes the place of the comforting familiarity. It is a fundamental difference in how reality is viewed and interacted with, not a question of dislike or resentment. This change is neither traumatic nor unexpected to the person who has left these structures. They saw it as the inevitable result of no longer being able to fit into a society that demands continual involvement in collective delusions. They don't fight against it or attempt to make meaningless connections. They are aware that when one party no longer requires the reinforcement, relationships based on mutual reinforcement cannot endure. What's left is a deep loneliness that comes from transformation rather than rejection. There is no need to fill this emptiness. It isn't a cause of pain either. It is merely a place of being, where real resonance, rather than unspoken agreements, governs relationships. For this reason, people who deviate from accepted social norms frequently find themselves isolated. It is not because they are incapable of connecting, or because they are unlovable. The reason for this is that most partnerships necessitate involvement in a common system, which they have decided to stop using. The drive to blend in, be understood, and be accepted no longer holds them back. Most individuals are unable to understand the space of freedom in which they live. And with this freedom, being alone is a natural state rather than a burden.